Gender-based violence is a universal reality, one that has been on the rise in recent years. Accordingly, authorities are seeking to better respond to this reality by raising greater awareness and taking practical action. For more, I have Park Ye-an from the Kongam Human Rights Law Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Ms. Park.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I also have Professor Susan Hess at the University of Southern California live on the line. Welcome to the program, Professor Hess.
Thank you so much.
We'll start here in the studio then. Ms. Park, as of late December 2019, the Women's Violence Prevention Act has been in place here in the country. And in recent days, the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family has been calling for a change to this name to Gender Violence Prevention Act. Could we start with a few words on the reasons behind this call?
So by coining the act as gender-based, we're trying to signify that the kind of crimes that we're dealing with here it's not just the crime that the victims happen to be women, but more broadly, we're trying to signify that the crimes has been committed because the victim was women. So there's a very huge difference between the two, and that the crime is stemming from your gender and gender hierarchy in our society. So by that, we are trying to cover not just women, but also males who are victimized because they are discriminated as having a less of a gender status.
I see. Professor Hess, what can you tell us now about public perception, that is, regarding gender-based violence over in the US?
Yes, so there's many things obviously that's developed since the pandemic. So safe at home does not mean safe at home for everyone. And we know that intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and gender-based violence have increased significantly during the global pandemic, and we still don't even know all the numbers. And traditionally, homelessness and domestic violence have been seen as separate issues. But what we've seen here in LA is that women who've experienced intimate partner violence make up a significant percentage of women experiencing homelessness, which has obviously increased since COVID. And due to COVID-19, survivors are staying in shelters longer, and DV shelter capacity has been significantly reduced. There have been some breakthroughs. The breakthroughs are, I'm sure a lot of people have seen this that went viral, the domestic violence hand gesture. That's the hand and the thumb and then your fingers that go on top. That is screaming out for help without expressing anything. And that went viral with a teenager who learned this on TikTok, and it saved her life. Also, the Violence Against Women's Act is the United States' response to develop legislation to protect individuals who have experienced intimate partner violence. There are laws in every state that address IPV, intimate partner violence against Women's Act. For Violence Against Women's Act, for example, it has a lot of protection for survivors with employment, housing, and legal services. However, from the provider side, it works very well for white women and not so much for LGBTQ2S+ and immigrants. A lot of the funding from VAWA goes to the criminal legal system responses versus prevention. So while we've come a long way, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Right. And back on the local front, Ms. Park, dating violence is yet another form of rampant abuse here in the country. Do tell us a bit about the legal frameworks in place to perhaps punish, of course, this action or this crime, I would say.
So like Professor has said, intimate partner violence is a rampant symptoms in our society nowadays. However, we are lacking the law to effectively address the violence that's committed not in domestic setting per se, but in a dating relationship. And I think the biggest reason behind the lack of or the legislative gap is because the society still views it as a personal event that's happening between the two people. And especially because it's happening in a romantic relationship oftentimes, it's not viewed as a serious crime. but we'll later talk about the stalking. But the seriousness of date violence is because it often foreshadow a more serious crimes that will follow. And up until now, we can address the crimes that happens between the dating relationship by leaning on other existing laws, such as laws for assault and batteries. And the effectiveness of such laws to address what's going on in a dating relationship, it's really lacking, to say the least. And it's often very lengthy and ineffective and very slow, so the victims are quite hesitant about seeking the help. And oftentimes what really worries the victims is that, okay, if I go to the legal authority and ask for help, and if they are very slow to respond, what's going to happen? Because the perpetrator is right there and they can retaliate, and it could very likely worsen the situations. So I feel very strongly about having the law to really effectively address this issue, but still it's a long way to go until the legislative authorities and the parliaments really realize the seriousness of the nature of this crime.
Right. And staying with dating violence, Professor Hess, what is the legal definition of dating violence in the US, and what legal safety nets, so to speak, are in place to discourage it there?
Yes, so thank you for that question. So intimate partner violence, because I keep throwing out all of these acronyms. So intimate partner violence, domestic violence, gender-based violence, teen violence are the same. And the US has done actually a lot of work on the definitions, and it's the same for individuals who cohabitate, marry, or date. And intimate partner violence occurs when an individual purposely causes harm or threatens the risk of harm to any past or current partner or spouse. Now, as the scope of the problem has become understood, intimate partner violence is now identified as a significant legal and public health issue, not just a family problem. And it's also important to recognize abuse occurs among people with varying backgrounds. So age, race, religion, financial status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and education. And even with VAWA, we really do need responses beyond a criminal legal system approach.
Right. Professor Hess, a protective order then against a partner can be secured even in the absence of a formal relationship like marriage then over in the US?
Yes.
I see. So they have a very strong safety net then compared to victims here in the country. And speaking of which, Ms. Park, a first ever anti-stalking law that you mentioned earlier went into effect in Korea back in October. And I believe it took us more than 20 years, is it, to enact this law? Why did it take so long? And please tell us a bit more about this anti-stalking law.
So like you said, anti-stalking law was first proposed back in 1999. So it took 22 years for us to have this law in place. But in the meantime, the crimes of stalking has escalated in a much, much higher degree. And the number has increased, but what we should know is this number of cases reported to legal authority are only the fraction of what's actually going on. And this anti-stalking law, now that we have it in place, it is very meaningful in a sense that we actually bring into people's mind that, okay, this kind of actions are punishable by law. It is not just, oh, I was emotionally distressed, it was just a spur of the moment thing, but now it is actually crime and you can be punished by it. And before, because we didn't have the law against stalking, we could only, the penalty for stalking someone, it was a puny 100,000 won fine, which is about $85 US dollars. So what kind of message does it send to the general public that it is okay and it is not an important issue for you to stalk someone? and people have just laughed it off. And if you go to legal authority to bring to their attention that this thing is happening, that you're being threatened, they'd be like, oh, it's just between the two of you, just talk it out. And now that we have the law in place, we can, it is punishable by up to 3 years in prison and 30 million won in fine. And if it involves weapons or other dangerous objects, it can get aggregated up to 5 years in prison or 50 million won in fines. So now it's just the beginning of just long course of action that we should take that to change people's perception of the seriousness of this kind of actions.
Right, and with this act, though, we are moving in the right direction, of course.
Yes, we are.
Right, and before we talk about the effectiveness of that act in detail, Professor Hess, what can you tell us about anti-stalking laws over in the US?
Yes, so in the US, the term stalking means engaging in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for his, her, or their safety or the safety of others, or to even suffer emotional distress. Now, what's interesting is that stalking, we have stalking orders, and they're similar to restraining orders, except the difference is that the petitioner can seek a stalking order against a stranger. The other piece is with restraining orders, oftentimes increase the violence, so they aren't so helpful here.
Professor Hess, what is the public overall perception with regard to the act of stalking then?
Could you repeat that question?
I was wondering, how is the act of stalking perceived by the public in the US? Because here in Korea, as Ms. Park has pointed out, in many times people think it's a personal issue between the two people involved and not for legal or for authorities to engage in.
Yes. So here we know that seeking help is critical. However, depending on help-seeking experiences, they're very diverse and often influenced by socio-cultural factors. Social media out here has actually been incredibly helpful for intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and stalking campaigns, especially for youth, where that's their really primary means of communicating. And another thing that is happening over here with stalking and within domestic violence is that social workers are going out with law enforcement, which could be super helpful because oftentimes it's very challenging to be able to have those conversations when you're in the heat of the moment.
Right. Ms. Park, meanwhile, here on the local front, there had been a bit of controversy regarding the anti-stalking law that you mentioned from the start. And almost as if to prove its futility, last month a woman was brutally killed by her ex-boyfriend despite being under police protection. What are your thoughts?
Well, like you said, the law had a lot of controversy even from the start because the effectiveness of actually preventing or protecting the victims, the measures that can go in to protect the victims were very much lacking and very weak. I would like to mention that the victims cannot go to the court to seek protection order from the court. And they can only get protection orders when they go to the police and the police take due steps to ask the court to have the protection order. And I just imagine the time that it takes when the perpetrator is knocking on the door, literally. And even when they had the protection order in place, we found out that it was ineffective. So when they gave out this smartwatch where you can, push the button to set the alarm off and the law enforcement was supposedly to come to your rescue, but it didn't work. And it was faulty. Was it a technical issue? We will find out. But I'm thinking, if we had this system of putting this anklet on perpetrators also, so it's not just the victim, but the perpetrator has to wear this anklet, and if they go, so they can set the range, and if the perpetrators approaches within that range, then the bell can go off and the law enforcement can be there to save them in time. And also, other issue that's very it's problematic is that this crime cannot be punished against the victim's will, which means that it will, if the victim says, okay, he did this wrong thing, he was stalking me, but I don't want him to be punished, then the law enforcement cannot go after him. And by that, what the law is doing is that it's increasing the chances of the victims being blackmailed or even coaxed by the perpetrator, like significantly high.
I see.
And so those two things, I think, is the most eminent two factors that we need to address to make this law more effective.
Right. And talking about making things effective, moving forward, Professor Hess, do share with us in detail, perhaps, the protocols involved in handling stalking offenses in the US to better protect the victims.
Yes, I mean, I'm not a stalking expert by any means, but I think a lot of work needs to be done outside of the criminal legal system. We know that the criminal legal system it's doing what it's meant to be doing. And I think a huge piece is really to reconsider what could be possible in terms of dismantling the current system that is not working. And the majority of the people who are incarcerated are Black and brown, and they're not really focused on, a lot of the reality that's happening. So I think we need to think outside the box, and I think we need community solutions.
Right. Meanwhile, Ms. Park, according to a report on CNN back in June, digital sex crime is so pervasive in Korea, the report said, and this fear of it, that is affecting the quality of life for young girls here in the country. To what extent do you believe that these words reflect the reality here in the country?
I think it's an understatement, actually. It's not just young females, but every females, we are being affected. When I go into public restroom, I have to look around all the time. And when I go to, say, sauna or even the doctor's office, I have to worry about those things. And this sense of security is really plummeting because of this digital sexual crimes and the ease of getting your hands on those hidden cameras and people's society in general, their attitudes towards consuming the videotapes or this kind of materials that were filmed against someone's will.
I see.
Yeah.
Professor Hess, your contributions now to serve victims of abuse have been highly acknowledged. And having said that, what can you share with us about ways to perhaps better support those who've been exposed to such atrocities?
Yes, so healing from trauma can be similar and different depending on the survivor. So for example, human trafficking has more considerations around safety as there's more than one person involved and often includes money. It's critical to work through the lens of trauma-informed care and consider cultural, historical, and gender issues. And there are many modalities that you can incorporate. However, a really huge piece is healing the mind and the body, as the body will remember the trauma.
Right, I see. Thank you very much for your words, Professor Hess, and your time, of course, at the SA. And Ms. Park here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you for having me.